You've probably been thinking about having a camp out in your backyard at the moment, perhaps setting up a fire pit, toasting some marshmallows, even setting up the tent and having a sleep. We're all spending more time in our backyards right now, and as the weather gets a little bit cooler and the daylight savings is end, it can be nice putting on a fire and sitting around it on your own or with family members. But one of the things that none of us like about a fire is smoke getting in our eyes. You don't want it to blow around your way and the ash and the smoke get in your eyes and it starts to sting and you can't see. From young through to old, none of us like having smoke in our eyes. You've got to be careful with our eyes around a fire from smoke and sparks, but also other things. The other night I was getting some more firewood and in a bit of a Russell Coit kind of moment, snapped the stick in the dark and it flicked a whole heap of dirt up into my eyes. We've got to be careful with our eyes. Now Jesus tells us that we all have an eye problem. We can all be too quick to rush to somebody else to get a speck out of their eye when we have a log, a plank in our own eye. Jesus says we see a speck or think we can see a speck in someone else's eye, something tiny, yet we fail to recognise that in our own eye is this great big stick. We are all affected by sin. We've all got a log in our eyes. And Jesus says, therefore, we should not judge. Have a look with me again in verse 1 and 2 of Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Jesus says we need to judge less. And what he's talking about here is not putting ourselves above others, being critical. When Luke records this same speech from Jesus, this same teaching, Luke adds of Jesus' words to not be condemning. It's kind of an attitude and a posture of looking out for fault in other people in such a way that we can make ourselves feel better about us by putting ourselves above them and that we might look down on them. And Jesus warns in verse 2 that our method of doing this will be the very method by which we are judged. Yeah, it'll change the way that other people see us, but he's ultimately talking about God being the judge of us. And if we're going to have a standard of judgment that's picky and condemning and critical and about putting ourselves up, God will use that same imperfect standard of judgment against us. So Jesus says, judge less and recognise that we have a perfect judge over us in God the Father. Now, this is not to say that there is no place for judgment, that there's no place for discernment or even critique. There is a place for that. Have a look at verse 6. Verse 6, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Jesus here is giving permission to his disciples, his followers, to make a discerning call, a judgment call, in a fairly rare and unique situation where somebody is completely hardened to the spiritual truths of the gospel, to no longer hand them over, to not be giving what is sacred to dogs or something that is valuable that's just going to be snorted up by pigs. There is a place for discernment and judgment. And down in verse 12, Jesus invites us and commands us to judge ourselves. Verse 12, so in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Or over in verse 15, Jesus again says to be discerning, to have a critique to our judgment. Verse 15, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. We're not just to gobble up everything that we hear, even if it sounds like it's got some gospel truth in it. And verse 23, Jesus says, I'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Now Jesus will make a judgment. He will discern between those who are his followers and those who aren't. So while Jesus says we're to judge less, there is a place for judgment and discernment and even critique, but always in such a way that we are not out to find fault in another so that we can boost ourselves up. John Chrysostom was a Christian leader, pastor, preacher from hundreds, thousands years or more ago. And he said this about judgment of one another. Correct one another, but not as a foe, nor as an adversary exacting revenge, but as a physician providing medicine. Medicine is such a good thing. When we're sick or we're in pain, medicine soothes, it makes us feel better, and it makes us better. And that's how we will use judgment and humble judgment and wise discernment to help one another as friends, giving a medicine. Now, in our present difficulty of living a bit more closely to the people in our home and having our work and study and hobbies and sport interrupted, in difficult times like this, it's easy for us to see faults in other people, to see those faults and for them to be magnified, yet at the same time the faults in ourselves to be minimised. It's a time where that log really sticks out of our own eyes. As we're living closely with one another, as we're following commentary on our leaders in the media, as we're watching what our neighbours and people round about us are doing, it's easy to magnify faults in others while minimising faults in ourselves. And so here's something that might help us in that. Help us to be aware of the log in our own eye rather than magnifying the speck in other people's eye. Before you find fault in somebody else and verbalise it, stop and find 2 faults in yourself and verbalise it before God in prayer. Now, before you find that fault in somebody else and point it out or make the comment, or just pause for a moment. Look inward and find 2 faults in yourself and turn them into a humble prayer before God. By doing something like this, we will have a growing recognition of God's presence with us as a good and perfect judge. And we'll keep growing in our humble dependence on him and growing in wise discernment. Well, from here we're going to spend some time in reflection and prayer. There's a song that you can click on and listen to. You might sing along with it, or you might just like to listen and pray and reflect. It's a song that acknowledges and recognises that we need Christ present in us and with us. And when you get to the end of the song, you'll find some words printed there, a prayer that you can pray aloud as a prayer of confession before God, inviting him, or first of all, asking for forgiveness for when we judge too much, and asking him to help us to be wise and discerning, to judge less, and when we do, that it is like providing medicine to the people round about us.